Understand. Once people know what pleases you and what angers you, they turn into trained poodles, working to charm you with apparent good behavior. Keep them in suspense. Make them think of you constantly and want to please you but never know just how to do it. Once they are in the trap, you will have a magnetic pull over them. Motivation will become automatic. Reversal. If morale is contagious, so is its opposite. Fear and discontent can spread through your troops like wildfire. The only way to deal with them is to cut them off before they turn into panic and rebellion. In 58 BC, when Rome was fighting the Gallic War, Julius Caesar was preparing for battle against the Germanic leader Ariovistus. Rumors about the ferocity and size of the German forces were flying, and his army was panicky and mutinous. Caesar acted fast. First, he had the rumor mongers arrested. Next, he addressed his soldiers personally, reminding them of their brave ancestors who had fought and defeated the Germans. He would not lead their weaker descendants into battle. Since the 10th Legion alone seemed immune to the growing panic, he would take them alone. As Caesar prepared to march with the valiant 10th Legion, the rest of the army, ashamed, begged him to forgive them and let them fight. With a show of reluctance, he did so, and these once frightened men fought fiercely. In such cases, you must act like Caesar, turning back the tide of panic. Waste no time and deal with the whole group. People who spread panic or mutiny experience a kind of madness in which they gradually lose contact with reality. Appeal to their pride and dignity. Make them feel ashamed of their moment of weakness and madness. Remind them of what they have accomplished in the past and show them how they are falling short of the ideal. This social shaming will wake them up and reverse the dynamic. Here are further reflections on morale strategy. From Rules of War and Bravery by Mubarak Shah. You can do nothing with an army that is an amalgam of 100 people here, 100 people there, and so on. What can be achieved with 4,000 men united and standing shoulder to shoulder, you cannot do with 40 or even 400,000 men who are divided and pulled this way and that by internal conflicts. From King Henry V by William Shakespeare. What stronger breastplate than a heart untainted? Thrice is he armed that hath his quarrel just, and he but naked, though locked up in steel, whose conscience with injustice is corrupted. By Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. There are always moments when the commander's place is not back with his staff, but up with the troops. It is sheer nonsense to say that maintenance of the men's morale is the job of the battalion commander alone. The higher the rank, the greater the effect of the example. The men tend to feel no kind of contact with the commander who they know is sitting somewhere in headquarters. What they want is what might be termed a physical contact with him. In moments of panic, fatigue, or disorganization, or when something out of the ordinary has to be demanded from them, the personal example of the commander works wonders, especially if he has had the wit to create some sort of legend around himself. From Mastering the Art of War, Zhuge Liang's and Liu Ji's commentaries on the classic by Sun Tzu. During the spring and autumn era, the state of Qi was invaded by the states of Jin and Yan. At first, the invaders overcame the military forces of Qi. One of the eminent nobles of the court of Qi recommended the martialist Tian Rongju to the Lord of Qi. To this man, later called Sima Rongju, is attributed the famous military handbook, Suma's Art of War. The Lord of Qi then summoned Rongju to discuss military matters with him. The Lord was very pleased with what Rongju had to say, and he made him a general, appointing him to lead an army to resist the aggression of the forces of Yan and Jin. Rangju said, "I am lowly in social status, yet the Lord has promoted me from the ranks and placed me above even the grandees. The soldiers are not yet loyal to me, and the common people are not familiar with me. As a man of little account, my authority is slight. I request one of your favorite ministers, someone honored by the state, to be overseer of the army." The Lord acceded to this request and appointed a nobleman to be the overseer. Rangju took his leave, arranging to meet the nobleman at the military headquarters at noon the following day. Then Rangju hastened back to set up a sundial and a water clock to await the new overseer. Now this new overseer was a proud and haughty aristocrat, and he imagined that as overseer he was leading his own army. Because of his pride and arrogance, he did not see any need to hurry, in spite of his promise with Rangju, the martial master. His relatives and close associates gave him a farewell party, and he stayed to drink with them. At noon the next day, the new overseer had not arrived at headquarters. Rangju took down the sundial and emptied the water clock. He assembled the troops and informed them of the agreement with the new overseer. That evening the nobleman finally arrived. Rangju said to him, "Why are you late?" He said, "My relatives, who are grandees, gave me a farewell party, so I stayed for that." Rangju said, "On the day a military leader receives his orders, he forgets about his home. When a promise is made in the face of battle, one forgets his family. When the war drums sound, one forgets his own body. Now hostile states have invaded our territory. The state is in an uproar. The soldiers are exposed at the borders. The Lord cannot rest or enjoy his food. The lives of the common people all depend on you. How can you talk about farewell parties?" Rangju then summoned the officer in charge of military discipline and asked him, "According to military law, what happens to someone who arrives later than an appointed time?" The officer replied, "He is supposed to be decapitated." Terrified, the aristocrat had a messenger rush back to report this to the Lord and beseech him for help. But the haughty nobleman was executed before the messenger even returned, and his execution was announced to the army. The soldiers all shook with fear. Eventually, the Lord sent an emissary with a letter pardoning the nobleman, who was, after all, the new overseer of the army. The emissary galloped right into camp on horseback with the Lord's message. Rangju said, "When a general is in the field, there are orders he doesn't take from the ruler." He also said to the disciplinary officer, "It is a rule that there shall be no galloping through camp, yet now the emissary has done just that. What should be done with him?" The officer said he should be executed. The emissary was petrified, but Rangju said, "It is not proper to kill an emissary of the Lord," and had 2 of the emissary's attendants executed in his stead. This, too, was announced to the army. Rangju sent the emissary back to report to the Lord, and then he set out with the army. When the soldiers made camp, Rangju personally oversaw the digging of wells, construction of stoves, preparation of food and drink, and care of the sick. He shared all of the supplies of the leadership with the soldiers, personally eating the same rations as they. He was especially kind to the weary and weakened. After 3 days, Rangju called the troops to order. Even those who were ill wanted to go along, eager to go into battle for Rangju. When the armies of Jin and Yan heard about this, they withdrew from the state of Qi. Now Rangju led his troops to chase them down and strike them. Eventually, he recovered lost territory and returned with the army victorious. From Aesop's Fables. The Wolves and the Dogs at War. One day, enmity broke out between the dogs and the wolves. The dogs elected a Greek to be their general, but he was in no hurry to engage in battle, despite the violent intimidation of the wolves. "Understand," he said to them, "why I deliberately put off engagement. It is because one must always take counsel before acting. The wolves, on the one hand, are all of the same race, all of the same color. But our soldiers have very varied habits, and each one is proud of his own country. Even their colors are not uniform. Some are black, some russet, and others white or ash gray. How can I lead into battle those who are not in harmony, and who are all dissimilar. In all armies, it is unity of will and purpose which assures victory over the enemy. By Colonel Charles d'Audiobook. Hannibal was the greatest general of antiquity by reason of his admirable comprehension of the morale of combat, of the morale of the soldier, whether his own or the enemy's. He shows his greatness in this respect in all the different incidents of war, of campaign, of action. His men were not better than the Roman soldiers. They were not as well armed, one half less in number. Yet he was always the conqueror. He understood the value of morale. He had the absolute confidence of his people. In addition, he had the art, in commanding an army, of always securing the advantage of morale. By Colonel Charles d'Audiobook. 4 brave men who do not know each other will not dare to attack a lion. 4 less brave, but knowing each other well, sure of their reliability, and consequently of mutual aid, will attack resolutely. There is the science of the organization of armies in a nutshell. From the Iliad by Homer. The Greeks met the Trojans without a tremor. Agamemnon ranged among them, commanding, "Be men, my friends, fight with valor and with a sense of shame before your comrades. You are less likely to be killed with a sense of shame. Running away never won glory or a fight." From The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. He suddenly lost concern for himself and forgot to look at a menacing fate. He became not a man, but a member. He felt that something of which he was a part, a regiment, an army, a cause, or a country, was in a crisis. He was welded into a common personality which was dominated by a single desire. For some moments he could not flee, no more than a little finger can commit a revolution from a hand. There was a consciousness always of the presence of his comrades about him. He felt the subtle battle brotherhood more potent even than the cause for which they were fighting. It was a mysterious fraternity, born of the smoke and danger of death. From King Henry V by William Shakespeare. Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead. In peace there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger. Stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard-favored rage. Then lend the eye a terrible aspect. Let it pry through the portage of the head like the brass cannon. Let the brow o'erwhelm it as fearfully as doth a galled rock o'erhang and jutty his confounded base, swilled with the wild and wasteful ocean. Now set the teeth and stretch the nostril wide. Hold hard to the breath and bend up every spirit to his full height. On, you noblest English, whose blood is fet from fathers of war-proof. Fathers that, like so many Alexanders, have in these parts from morn till even fought and sheathed their swords for lack of argument. Dishonor not your mothers. Now attest that those whom you called fathers did beget you. Be copy now to men of grosser blood, and teach them how to war. And you, good yeomen, whose limbs were made in England, show us here the mettle of your pasture. Let us swear that you are worth your breeding, which I doubt not. For there is none of you so mean and base that hath not noble luster in your eyes. I see you stand like greyhounds in the slips, straining upon the start. The game's afoot. Follow your spirit, and upon this charge cry, God for Harry, England, and St. George. From The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. Mercenary and auxiliary arms are useless and dangerous, and if one keeps his state founded on mercenary arms, one will never be firm or secure, for they are disunited, ambitious, without discipline, unfaithful, bold among friends, among enemies, cowardly. No fear of God, no faith with men. Ruin is postponed only as long as attack is postponed. And in peace you are despoiled by them, in war by the enemy. The cause of this is that they have no love nor cause to keep them in the field other than a small stipend, which is not sufficient to make them want to die for you. And lastly, by Frederick the Great. If you wish to be loved by your soldiers, husband their blood, and do not lead them to slaughter. Part 3. Defensive Warfare. To fight in a defensive manner is not a sign of weakness. It is the height of strategic wisdom, a powerful style of waging war. Its requirements are simple. First, you must make the most of your resources, fighting with perfect economy and engaging only in battles that are necessary. Second, you must know how and when to retreat, luring an aggressive enemy into an imprudent attack. Then, waiting patiently for his moment of exhaustion, launch a vicious counterattack. In a world that frowns on displays of overt aggression, the ability to fight defensively, to let others make the first move and then wait for their own mistakes to destroy them, will bring you untold power. Because you waste neither energy nor time, you are always ready for the next inevitable battle. Your career will be long and fruitful. To fight this way, you must master the arts of deception. By seeming weaker than you are, you can draw the enemy into an ill-advised attack. By seeming stronger than you are, perhaps through an occasional act that is reckless and bold, you can deter the enemy from attacking you. In defensive warfare, you are essentially leveraging your weaknesses and limitations into power and victory. The following 4 chapters will instruct you in the basic arts of defensive warfare: economy of means, counterattack, intimidation and deterrence, and how to retreat skillfully and lie low when under aggressive attack. Chapter 8. Pick your battles carefully. The perfect economy strategy. We all have limitations. Our energies and skills will take us only so far. Danger comes from trying to surpass our limits. Seduced by some glittering prize into overextending ourselves, we end up exhausted and vulnerable. You must know your limits and pick your battles carefully. Consider the hidden costs of a war: time lost, political goodwill squandered, an embittered enemy bent on revenge. Sometimes it is better to wait, to undermine your enemies covertly rather than hitting them straight on. If battle cannot be avoided, get them to fight on your terms. Aim at their weaknesses. Make the war expensive for them and cheap for you. Fighting with perfect economy, you can outlast even the most powerful foe. The spiral effect. In 281 BC, war broke out between Rome and the city of Tarentum on Italy's east coast. Tarentum had begun as a colony of the Greek city of Sparta. Its citizens still spoke Greek, considered themselves cultured Spartans, and thought other Italian cities barbaric. Rome, meanwhile, was an emerging power, locked in a series of wars with neighboring cities. The prudent Romans were reluctant to take on Tarentum. It was Italy's wealthiest city at the time, rich enough to finance its allies in a war against Rome. It was also too far away, off in the southeast, to pose an immediate threat. But the Tarentines had sunk some Roman ships that had wandered into their harbor, killing the fleet's admiral. And when Rome had tried to negotiate a settlement, its ambassadors had been insulted. Roman honor was at stake, and it readied itself for war. Tarentum had a problem. It was wealthy, but had no real army. Its citizens had gotten used to easy living. The solution was to call in a Greek army to fight on its behalf. The Spartans were otherwise occupied, so the Tarentines called on King Pyrrhus of Epirus, 319 to 272 BC, the greatest Greek warrior king since Alexander the Great. Epirus was a small kingdom in west-central Greece. It was a poor land, sparsely populated, with meager resources, but Pyrrhus, raised on stories of Achilles, from whom his family claimed to be descended, and of Alexander the Great, a distant cousin, was determined to follow in the footsteps of his illustrious ancestors and relatives, expanding Epirus and carving out his own empire. As a young man, he had served in the armies of other great military men, including Ptolemy, the general of Alexander's who now ruled Egypt. Pyrrhus had quickly proved his value as a warrior and leader. In battle, he had become known for leading dangerous charges, earning himself the nickname the Eagle. Back in Epirus, he had built up a small army and trained it well, even managing to defeat the much larger Macedonian army in several battles. Pyrrhus's reputation was on the rise, but it was hard for a small country like his to gain ascendancy over more powerful Greek neighbors like the Macedonians, the Spartans, and the Athenians. And the Tarentines' offer was tempting. First, they promised him money and a large army raised from allied states. Second, by defeating the Romans, he could make himself master of Italy, and from Italy, he could take first Sicily, then Carthage in North Africa. Alexander had moved east to create his empire. Pyrrhus could move west and dominate the Mediterranean. He accepted the offer. In the spring of 280 BC, Pyrrhus set sail with the largest Greek army ever to cross into Italy. 20,000 foot soldiers, 3,000 horsemen, 2,000 bowmen, and 20 elephants. Once in Tarentum, though, he realized he had been tricked. Not only did the Tarentines have no army, they had made no effort to assemble one, leaving Pyrrhus to do it himself. Pyrrhus wasted no time. He declared a military dictatorship in the city and began to build and train an army from among the Tarentines as fast as possible. Pyrrhus's arrival in Tarentum worried the Romans, who knew his reputation as a strategist and fighter. Deciding to give him no time to prepare, they quickly sent out an army, forcing Pyrrhus to make do with what he had, and he set off to face them. The two armies met near the town of Heraclea. Pyrrhus and his troops were outnumbered and at one point were on the verge of defeat when he unleashed his secret weapon. His elephants, with their massive weight, loud, fearsome trumpeting, and soldiers on top, firing arrows down at will. The Romans had never faced elephants in battle before, and panic spread among them, turning the tide of the fight. Soon, the disciplined Roman legions were in headlong retreat. The Eagle had won a great victory. His fame spread across the Italian peninsula. He was indeed the reincarnation of Alexander the Great. Now other cities sent him reinforcements, more than making up for his losses at Heraclea. But Pyrrhus was worried. He had lost many veterans in the battle, including key generals. More important, the strength and discipline of the Roman legions had impressed him. They were like no other troops he had faced. He decided to try to negotiate a peaceful settlement with the Romans, offering to share the peninsula with them. At the same time, though, he marched on Rome to give the negotiations urgency and to make it clear that unless the Romans sued for peace, they would face him again. Meanwhile, the defeat at Heraclea had had a powerful effect on the Romans, who were not easily intimidated and did not take defeat lightly. Immediately after the battle, a call went out for recruits, and young men responded in droves. The Romans proudly rejected the offer of a settlement. They would never share Italy. The two armies met again near the town of Asculum, not far from Rome, in the spring of 279 BC. This time their numbers were about equal. The first day of battle was fierce, and once again the Romans seemed to have the edge, but on the second day, Pyrrhus, a strategic master, managed to lure the Roman legions onto terrain better suited to his own style of maneuvering. and he gained the advantage. As was his wont, near the end of the day, he personally led a violent charge at the heart of the Roman legions, elephants in front. The Romans scattered, and Pyrrhus was once again victorious. King Pyrrhus had now scaled the heights, yet he felt only gloom and foreboding. His losses had been terrible. The ranks of the generals he depended on were decimated, and he himself had been badly wounded. At the same time, the Romans seemed inexhaustible, undaunted by their defeat. When congratulated on his victory at Asculum, he replied, "If we defeat the Romans in one more such battle, we shall be totally ruined." Pyrrhus, however, was already ruined. His losses at Asculum were too large to be quickly replaced, and his remaining forces were too few to fight the Romans again. His Italian campaign was over. Interpretation. From the story of King Pyrrhus and his famous lament after the Battle of Asculum comes the expression Pyrrhic victory, signifying a triumph that is as good as a defeat, for it comes at too great a cost. The victor is too exhausted to exploit his win, too vulnerable to face the next battle. And indeed, after the victory at Asculum, Pyrrhus staggered from one disaster to the next, his army never quite strong enough to defeat his growing hosts of enemies. This culminated in his untimely death in battle, ending Epirus's hopes to become a power in Greece. Pyrrhus could have avoided this downward spiral. Advanced intelligence would have told him about both the disciplined ferocity of the Romans and the decadence and treachery of the Tarentines. And knowing this, he could have taken more time to build an army or canceled the expedition altogether. Once he saw that he had been tricked, he could have turned back. After Heraclea, there would still be time to retrench, consolidate, quit while he was ahead. Had he done any of this, his story might have had a different ending. But Pyrrhus could not stop himself. The dream was too alluring. Why worry about the costs? He could recover later. One more battle, one more victory would seal the deal. Pyrrhic victories are much more common than you might think. Excitement about a venture's prospects is natural before it begins, and if the goal is enticing, we unconsciously see what we want to see. More of the possible gains, fewer of the possible difficulties. The further we go, the harder it becomes to pull back and rationally reassess the situation. In such circumstances, the costs tend not just to mount, they spiral out of control. If things go badly, we get exhausted, which leads us to make mistakes, which lead to new, unforeseen problems, which in turn lead to new costs. Any victories we might have along the way are meaningless. Understand, the more you want the prize, the more you must compensate by examining what getting it will take. Look beyond the obvious costs and think about the intangible ones. The goodwill you may squander by waging war, the fury of the loser if you win, the time that winning may take, your debt to your allies. You can always wait for a better time. You can always try something more in line with your resources. Remember, history is littered with the corpses of people who ignored the costs. Save yourself unnecessary battles and live to fight another day. From The Art of War by Sun Tzu. When the weapons have grown dull and spirits depressed, when our strength has been expended and resources consumed, then others will take advantage of our exhaustion to arise. Then, even if you have wise generals, you cannot make things turn out well in the end. Strengths and weaknesses. When Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603, ascended the throne of England in 1558, she inherited a second-rate power. The country had been racked by civil war, and its finances were in a mess. Elizabeth dreamed of creating a long period of peace in which she could slowly rebuild England's foundations, and particularly its economy. A government with money was a government with options. England, a small island with limited resources, could not hope to compete in war with France and Spain, the great powers of Europe. Instead, it would gain strength through trade and economic stability. Year by year, for 20 years, Elizabeth made progress. Then, in the late 1570s, her situation suddenly seemed dire. An imminent war with Spain threatened to cancel all the gains of the previous 2 decades. The Spanish king, Philip II, was a devout Catholic who considered it his personal mission to reverse the spread of Protestantism. The Low Countries, now Holland and Belgium, were properties of Spain at the time, but a growing Protestant rebellion was threatening its rule, and Philip went to war with the rebels, determined to crush them. Meanwhile, his most cherished dream was to restore Catholicism to England. His short-term strategy was a plot to have Elizabeth assassinated and then to place her half-sister, the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, on the British throne. In case this plan failed, his long-term strategy was to build an immense armada of ships and invade England. Philip did not keep his intentions well hidden, and Elizabeth's ministers saw war as inevitable. They advised her to send an army to the Low Countries